Welcome to the State of the Nation. Today we are in conversation with the CEO of the Free Market Foundation, David Ansara. It's been a while since we've had David with us. David, welcome to the State of the Nation studio. Good to have you here.
Yeah, it's fantastic to be here, Mike.
I think last time we spoke it was still online and it was a bit of a different world at that time.
Yes, indeed. We were in the grip of the COVID pandemic. I don't know which phase of it was.
Yeah, geez, we were busy going through the phases, and we ran out of Greek words, didn't we? But welcome back. It's good to have you here. And obviously, South Africa is in an interesting position at the moment. David, you're here. I recently spoke to some of the people that you have dealings with, John Andres, Chris Hutting. We discussed one thing, and I've said this on every occasion. Whenever I open my mouth, there's only one thing that comes out of it. And that is this move by business to prop up the ANC government when we are in an election cycle. Right? I make no bones about it. I think it's the most disgusting thing I've seen. I think it's a betrayal, and I think it's unpatriotic. So in case you have any confusion as to how I feel about it, let's kick off from that base. You've written about it, you've spoken about it. What do you make of big corporates propping up the ANC in the election cycle?
Well, I think it's driven by a political naivety, actually. I think many businesses see the state of the country. They see very high levels of unemployment, low growth, decaying infrastructure, and they think something needs to be done to fix these problems. But I think one of the things that many business leaders are missing is a root cause analysis. What actually created these conditions in the first place? And if you take the media's word for it, it's all about corruption, poor governance, mismanagement. But behind that really lies an ideological thrust to policy. So policy is downstream from ideology, from the ideas that infuse and inform the policy framework. And these effects, these symptoms that we see are a consequence of that. So over the last few decades, we've seen business go through a very interesting evolution and journey. So post-94, there's a lot of enthusiasm for the ANC government. There was a sense of, well, we need to help the new South Africa to succeed and thrive. And then there was an interesting incident during the Mbeki presidency when Tony Treyer, who was the head of Anglo-American, where he said something to the effect of, well, we're still evaluating the political risk situation in South Africa. It hasn't totally diminished. This was in the context of Anglo moving its listing to London. And he got a very stern rebuke from President Mbeki in his weekly newsletter, saying, point out these political risk factors. Where was the mining industry during the apartheid period? Then, we've seen others like Ruel Khoza, who was at one point the chairman of Nedbank. I think this was in 2013.
Yeah, and there was the FNB advert or piece that they took in the
Correct.
paper, having a go at government. They had to walk back from that.
Yeah, so in many respects, these events really chastened the business leadership community.
Yeah.
And they were very quickly brought into line, and there was a lot of stern rebukes from people like Gwede Mantashe and so on, accusations of being part of a liberal counter-insurgency or counter-revolution. And so business sort of retreated into its shell. And then during the so-called state capture period, there was suddenly a bit of a shift. Nhlanhla Nene was fired by President Zuma in December 2015. There was the Nenegate saga. He was replaced by Des van Rooyen, the weekend special finance minister. And during that weekend, senior business leaders like Stephen Koseff, for example, they rallied to put pressure on the government to reverse this very damaging decision. Remember, the rand absolutely tanked. There was a mass capital flight from the country. The risk on sentiment was high. And that, I think, began a process of business becoming increasingly more involved in ANC politics and factional battles within the ANC, because that then evolved into financial and public support for Mr. Ramaphosa in his campaign against Jacob Zuma's proxy candidate, his ex-wife, Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma. And so when Ramaphosa won the presidency of the ANC at Nasrec 1 in 2017, December, there was this very high expectation, well, now business is going to yield the dividends from this investment. And there was great expectation that reform was going to be forthcoming. South Africa had been enduring many years of low growth, the so-called lost years of the Zuma years. That reform, as we know, did not materialize. And my erstwhile colleagues and myself at the IRR and also the Free Market Foundation were very critical of the so-called reform agenda. And it's taken, I think, the business community a long time and the public at large to really come to terms with the fact that Mr. Ramaphosa was never a reformer. He's not a frustrated reformer or that his hands are tied by internal party politics. He simply was not that way inclined.
What was advertised on the box.
Yeah.
But now, if it's taken them a time to realize that he's not the reformer, he's not the free market capitalist that people were touting him as, he's a lethargic, ideologically driven leader who's asleep at the wheel, who has not reversed the state capture at all. In fact, we went through the whole pain of having a state capture commission, and many of his ministers were fingered in that commission, and he still went and appointed them afterwards. You know, you've got people like Nomvula Makanyane, you've got Gwedi Mantashe, people who've been fingered in state capture, but yet he went and appointed them anyway. The economy has continued its slide. We have power when the good grace of God feels like giving us power. We've got worsening security and policing. And do you think business only now realizes, oh dear, maybe we should help them? Help them what? Help them to stay in power, because that's the way I read it.
Well, I think this year has been very interesting, Mike, because what you saw at the beginning of the year was a number of senior business leaders coming out, particularly in the wake of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and saying and being overtly critical of government policy, like Alan Pullinger from RMB, talking about government's response or muddled response to the Ukraine invasion being unacceptable. You had Ralph Mupita, the MTN CEO. He was saying that South Africa is at risk of becoming a failed state. So he was talking about the energy crisis that's affecting the telecoms company. They, by the way, spent 695 million rand in the last financial year just on keeping their cell phone network powered through diesel and batteries. We had Gareth Ackerman from Pick n Pay, who also has quite a hefty diesel bill of 60 million rand per month that Pick n Pay is spending on keeping its cold storage supply chains going. So you're now having these businesses actually facing these costs on their balance sheet. Like, this is not just political, ideological, conceptual type of disagreements. This is really affecting their bottom line. And so you had a lot of this public criticism, and then you had, in the beginning of the year, Mr. Ramaphosa saying, business leaders need to get off the couch, stop complaining, and help the government, right? And this triggered off a set of events which culminated in the so-called partnership initiative, where over, I think the number is 115 CEOs now, have publicly committed to help fix the polycrisis, if you will, in South Africa, the woeful state of the energy supply system, the breakdown in the country's infrastructure. There's been something like 60 billion rands worth of damage caused by the construction mafia, these criminal syndicates, particularly in KZN, which are essentially stopping new construction projects from going ahead. So the state, even though it has this very ambitious scope, wants to meddle in all aspects of the economy and also society, its capacity to do so has diminished, and it is essentially collapsing under its own weight. And this is leaving a void.
Yeah.
And I think businesses, if I were to give them the benefit of the doubt, they're saying, well, they look around and they say, the country is in a mess. Let's help to get us out of it. And they think that they're pursuing the patriotic objective of fixing the country. But actually, sometimes the patriotic thing to do is to criticize the government.
Yeah, or to let them lose an election, because, we've got to take it back to the fact that we're in an election cycle, right?
Correct.
So, this isn't just any other time. This is less than a year to our next election. The ANC looking vulnerable. They are the cause of all the problems, that everything that needs addressing, that business has said, don't worry, we'll step in and help you. Neil Froneman, I'm such a hero. I'm going to help sort out state security, and Mike Brown, who won't talk to me, he's going to sort out something else, and these guys are going to sort out all this kind of stuff. All that could happen is, if they're successful, the ANC looks good. If they're unsuccessful and the ANC gets voted out or does poorly at the next election, they can go and say, you see, business is not so good at what they say. What you guys all say that business is good, but they couldn't save the country, even though it's in brackets from ourselves. Yeah. So, I cannot, there's not one, but these are not, you say maybe, they don't really understand, or naivety, or call it what you will. These are not stupid people, one would imagine, that are leading these corporates, but yet surely they understand that they could be prolonging our agony by keeping the ANC in power. Surely they have to have made that calculation.
Well, look, a good business person might be good at running a business, but that doesn't necessarily always translate into understanding the political landscape and the complex dynamics that infuse it.
Well, let's hope, and I mean, I know that before we started, we were speaking about there's another more nefarious part to this, and that is that those companies who have reached a monopoly position, or at least a very commanding position within these industries, be they mining, finance, etc., rely heavily on government regulation to keep other competitors out. Do you think they're doing this so that once again they get to set the regulatory agenda?
Many big established corporates can afford to hire a team of compliance experts to check all of the boxes. And as you correctly point out, the more regulation there is, the higher the barriers to entry for new market participants. So there is definitely an incumbency advantage that is exploited.
Yeah, there's a perverse incentive, isn't there, for them to keep the country governed badly, but at least they get to monopolize certain critical industries like finance, like banking, etc.
Yes, but I would also issue a warning to those incumbents that that process of overregulation and ceding power and control of your equity, of your assets to the government, that government can easily regulate you out of existence. And I think the big cautionary tale here is the mining industry. In the early 2000s, the mining industry, in good faith, participated in discussions with the Department of Mineral Resources, and there was the formation of the Mining Charter, which at the time was an aspirational charter. It wasn't codified or binding in any way. It was just something that the mining industry committed to working towards in conjunction with government and other social partners like trade unions. And the BEE commitments that were made at that time, they were given very clear assurances. Look, we're not going to change the ratios of the BEE equity requirements here. These are not going to be extended. They're merely aspirational targets. And fast forward a few years later, and the mining industry found itself without control over the mineral resources that it was sinking large amounts of capital into exploiting. So basically, after the Agri-SA Constitutional Court case, basically the mining companies no longer controlled their mineral rights. The state controlled it. Those BEE targets were escalated to about 30%. There was subsequently a court case to challenge that. But we're not dealing with a good faith actor in this government. The government is hostile fundamentally to market-based economics and the profit motive and capitalism in general.
Which makes their decision to aid this government even more bizarre. Well, let's just then move our attention to, a topic that that I've been quite involved in, and that is there is an opposition coalition charter that I suppose is what they've called it, right? At one point, it had a terrible moniker of the Moonshot Pact, which I refuse to mention, but yet I have. The point is that a whole lot of the opposition parties, especially the official, most notably the official opposition and other parties, got together to put together a charter of opposition parties. These are parties who have said at least, and I know in as much as we can trust a politician, they've said at least that they are going to be like-minded, put in sort of almost a coalition agreement ahead of the election so everybody knows where they stand. And these are meant to be players that are see the world similarly in terms of free markets, property rights, the end of racial discrimination in this country, which we've lived with for 80 years. That's what that coalition is built on. Now, they went to Empress Palace, banged out an agreement of sorts, which is still work in progress. And the media, not this particular channel, but the sort of broader media, has been absolutely scathing, saying this opposition alliance has got nothing to offer and they will not succeed in any way and nobody really is interested in them. And they only represent at the last election about 30% of the vote. What's your view of this opposition coalition charter?
Well, we as the Free Market Foundation are non-partisan, so we're not affiliated with any particular political party. But we have a very strong interest in promoting freedom in South Africa because freedom creates opportunity, prosperity, and also individual agency and self-empowerment. And I was very pleased to see in the multi-party charter that word freedom being used as one of the founding values. They also spoke about an open market economy being part of their vision, a non-racial redress for South Africans who have been harmed by discrimination in the past. So I think those are very positive signals. That is a different question to will they have the numbers to dislodge the ANC. I think there's still a long way to go on that, and there's still some political parties that are outside that could potentially galvanize this group and add more weight of numbers to that. But I think what's very interesting, if you look at some of the electoral dynamics, KwaZulu-Natal, I think, is going to be a key battleground for the future of politics in South Africa. We obviously had those terrible riots in 2021, which really exposed the fragility of the state and the strength of some of these criminal syndicates and networks that we spoke about earlier. There was also an expression of some of the pent-up frustration of ordinary South Africans that just boiled over, right? But you have some also interesting political dynamics. The ANC itself is very weak in the province, very divided there. There's very little, there's a growing sense that Zulu speakers post the Jacob Zuma presidency of being isolated within the party. So tribal politics, unfortunately, within the ANC is still very strong. And so there are a lot of votes up for grabs there in KwaZulu-Natal. And potentially we could see this union between the Democratic Alliance and the IFP bearing fruit in terms of dislodging the ANC from power at the provincial level in KZN. And just given the sheer size of the voting population in KZN, that could have significant ramifications for the national level politics as well. But look, things happen slowly and then suddenly in the world of politics, right? I think if you think about how things can change on a dime, and if you look throughout the history of South Africa, you see these inflection points where there was sort of an equilibrium that existed for many years, and then that was punctuated very suddenly. So the unbanning of the ANC and the PAC by F.W. de Klerk, that took most commentators by surprise. Who would have thought that the National Party would end up being absorbed into the structures of the ANC?
Yeah.
Who would have thought that the Progressive Party that the inheritors of the Progressive Party's Liberal mandate would one day become the official opposition, when back in the 60s and 70s they had one MP in the form of Helen Suzman in Parliament. So these shifts are quite glacial, and then suddenly you realize that the situation is different.
Yeah, there's also another aspect to it, and we've obviously done a lot of work, we've spoken to a lot of the parties involved with that coalition. One of the interesting things that I think is not being taken into account, and that is, even if that coalition is unable to get a majority, right, which is what they set out to do, and it doesn't look likely that they're going to get 50% plus one. But even if they get 40%, because obviously that 30% of the vote is a historic number that comes from the 2019 election, which was built on a slightly different foundation. You had Ramaphoria, you had quite a great hope that the ANC was suddenly going to become the ANC again of Nelson Mandela. So there was almost a positive disposition towards the ANC despite state capture for that particular window period. This guy was meant to fix up the country. The other thing that it doesn't take into account is it doesn't take into account Action SA, which has come on the scene, has made a bit of a splash. And it seems like, there's a thing in politics which people don't sometimes allow for, and that's energy. Energy is an unbelievable thing, and right now, the ANC seems to be bereft of energy. So,
and momentum.
And momentum. And, if you have a situation, let's just play out a scenario where an ANC together with an alliance partner, let's say they do a deal with a small alliance, partners to get 50% plus one. The EFF get 10%. They're not doing particularly well at the moment if one looks at by-elections. And you've got another opposition bloc with 40%, right? That opposition bloc, it means that every ANC MP has to be in Parliament to pass legislation. That's no simple thing. That's a political change that we don't understand. And we've seen up here in Gauteng with the performance in some of the municipalities, these metros that have been governed by coalitions, that the ANC hates governing. They hate ruling. Governing. They just don't like. They like ruling. They like being in charge where nobody can question their decisions or their motives. But they're not very good when it's pretty close and people are questioning what they're doing. So, I think that there's a part there to everybody that watches this. I say, please don't be despondent. Get out there and vote. Because this could make a complete change of what happens in Parliament, where right now the ANC can willy-nilly pass legislation. They've been able to do it for nearly 30 years, and they have done it. They've passed some pretty bad legislation. In the future, to pass that legislation, they're going to have everyone there and everyone awake, which you understand is not what they specialize in. So, whichever way you look at it, I'm saying from my perspective, this is a big thing, because you will have a coalition that could appeal to a lot of people, because there are a lot of different angles. As you've mentioned, you've got the DA, which is almost a classic Liberal party for what that's worth, although they've made some strange decisions around in the last while. You've got a new entrant in Action SA. You've got the IFP improving. There's a basis here that can grow. And I've just been stunned by the way the media has just absolutely written them off. But there's no doubt a change in politics in South Africa will mean a change in the way this country is governed.
Yeah, look, I think the media is often a lagging indicator rather than a leading indicator of the trends. But I think one of the themes that I'd like your audience to take away from this conversation is this idea of negotiation. So we were talking earlier about the business community, and they have been very tempted to join these so-called social compacts. Investment is low in the country, so the president convenes a social compact, and we have business, labor, and government all around the table. But that consensus is actually basically the reinforcement of the ANC's prevailing ideological agenda and their policy objectives, right? So what we've been asking is for business to abandon the consensus-seeking approach and adopt a negotiation mindset, to say, we can help, but we need something in return from the government. And that's a normal part of doing business, right? At the political level, these opposition parties are also having to negotiate with one another, to seek compromise, to engage in trade-offs. And in many respects, you mentioned Emperor's Palace, Kempton Park, where those historic constitutional negotiations took place in the early 90s. Since then, actually, South Africans have stopped negotiating. We've been quite comfortable in the ideological slipstream of the ANC. The ANC sets the agenda, whether it's transformation or the nature of economic policy, the role of the state. Everybody plays on the ANC's terms, but that's no longer going to be the case for the foreseeable future. So what I think is encouraging is that we can't expect all of these opposition parties to agree with one another. But the fact that they have sufficient consensus, to use that term from the early 1990s, I think is enough. And I also think we talk a lot in South Africa about our diversity. And it's almost become trite to say that this is a diverse society. But part of a highly plural democratic society is that we have different interests. People have different objectives, and that's fine. That's part of the competitive market of ideas that is a democracy. And so what I think we're starting to see is a coalescing of politics around different spheres of interests. And no longer will we have one prevailing dominant hegemony like we have had for the last few decades. So even if electorally the ANC manages to get the Good Party, for example, or Al Jamaah to join them in a post-2024 coalition with the ANC, the equilibrium has already been punctured. It's just a question of how that plays out. Yeah. And I think we should also not only think of those punctuations of the equilibrium as being elections. This will definitely be a turning point, a watershed election in South Africa's democratic history. But that elections are not the only thing that drive change. And look at the early 1990s in South Africa. There was a crisis that preceded the change. So crisis breeds change. And we have some pretty large crises developing in this country around unemployment, the failing economy, and also socially as well.
David, I want to sort of just ask your opinion on something. And I know that it's not necessarily something you cover. You do the work that you do at the Freedom Foundation, but we've recently had these annual BRICS shindig here in Johannesburg. For once our electricity stayed on. Sorry for the rest of the country. Joburg had power 24 hours a day. It was like the old days. It was wonderful, right? But aside from that and road blockages and some people collecting rubbish, it was quite nice to see our city at work for a change. But what do you make of BRICS and some of the discussion around the de-dollarization, end of Western hegemony? What do you make of those, of that particular, line that has been so prevalent as we've had to live through the BRICS time meeting here in Johannesburg?
Well, Mike, I'm still trying to figure that out, because essentially BRICS is a geopolitical club, right?
Yes.
And it's more, I think, defined by what it isn't than what it is. And Jim O'Neill, who was a Wall Street banker and analyst, he coined the term BRIC. And the common denominator between Brazil, Russia, India, and China, when he was writing, was that they had large population sizes that would form potentially significant markets. So the geopolitics has emerged later. And I think what is a big driver is Chinese power. And I think a lot will rise and fall on the fortunes of what happens within China. I think China has some pretty significant internal contradictions. The state is the predominant force there. And the liberalization that occurred under Deng Xiaoping from 1979 onwards really unleashed the latent potential of ordinary Chinese people to create prosperity for themselves. But we still had a lot of state involvement, obviously many state-owned enterprises. But Xi Jinping, who, if I'm not mistaken, has been in power since about 2013, he has really centralized power and restored the Maoist conception of of Chinese Communist Party rule. And I think that is distorting price signals within the Chinese economy. You've seen these ghost cities, that there was huge overinvestment in property because Chinese people couldn't really express their property rights in other areas. So they were very much encouraged to invest in these developments. And I think China is maybe more brittle than it appears from the outside. Even militarily, there's a lot of bluster around Chinese power. But as we've seen with the microchip wars, the trade wars, Taiwan produces most of the microchips, and there are sanctions and other things that have been imposed on China. So in terms of not sharing military intelligence and so on. So I think obviously the dynamics with Russia are also pretty significant. Mr. Putin wasn't here, and I think ultimately that was South Africa caving into pressure from the West. And I don't think that, I think South Africa's position within the global situation at the moment is quite ambiguous. I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong per se with taking a neutral stance, but then you must actually be neutral rather than covertly support one side against the other. So Charles de Gaulle, who was the French statesman, he said that countries don't have friends, they have interests. And so I think South Africa should and can play different interests off of one another to maximize its own interests. I don't think it's doing that particularly well at the moment. But and then I think the expansion of BRICS is potentially quite interesting as well. The number of countries that have expressed an interest, and I think this is positioned as some kind of union of the so-called global South. Yeah. But yeah, I think there's a long way to go. And on the currency, I think if this is just another vehicle for states to meddle with the money supply or to politicize the financial system, then I think that that's not going to work. Yeah. If you had a truly independent currency, like a cryptocurrency, for example, that had a fixed monetary supply, then you could say, okay, well, we're all going to agree to use this because it's fair rather than politicized.
And the fall of the dollar, I think, has been exaggerated to the extent, as I said to one of my guests recently, and she didn't take too kindly to it, is that I suppose the day you see corrupt leaders stuffing rupees or rubles or renminbi in their couches, in their sofas when they do dodgy deals, then the dollar may be under some kind of threat. But at the moment, whenever we've got a bag of something that we shouldn't have and somebody's prepared to give us a whole lot of cash, I think we still know which currency we'd like that cash in. So
yeah, look, if most people walk past $100 lying on the sidewalk, they'd pick it up.
Yeah.
But I don't think the Americans should be too complacent either. Yeah. And they've been able to increase the money supply in the United States, the Federal Reserve, through quantitative easing and all of those programs, because the US dollar has been this international reserve currency. But I think the sanctioning of Russia and freezing them out of the SWIFT international payments settlement system, also freezing some of their reserves, I think sent a very strong signal to other countries, most notably China, which holds a lot of US Treasury bonds, that your dollar reserves might not be safe if you fall foul of the Americans.
Yes.
And so they should be very careful about creating conditions that incentivize these countries to get off the dollar. It's in their interest to have everybody still on it. So that could be one of those things where the change happens slowly and then suddenly.
David and Ansara, thank you so much for coming here. It's been wonderfully illuminating. To everybody that joined us today, I hope you enjoyed it. It really is good having you around. If you've watched till this far, please keep on subscribing to the State of the Nation channel. It's growing nicely. And if you really like us, please join our supporters club. We are now about to start sending some content exclusively to the supporters club. So once again, thank you so much for joining us here on the State of the Nation, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you, and thank you to David.
Thanks, Mike.